Right, so before we get started for today, I just want to give an opportunity for the members of the various mathematics education organizations here in Ontario, as well as elsewhere in Canada. If there are any updates to share, be happy to see them within the chat log. So we'll give that a minute before we get going. Excellent. So we've got an update from CMS, from UTM, and from the first year mathematics. Okay. Again, feel free if you have any updates to share relating to MathEd in the month coming up. We won't be meeting again next month for the or until September. So it'd be great to get that information out there. Okay, I think from here we can probably continue on. So just looking at the agenda for today, we're going to be starting off with a pretty kind of balanced session today, where really, when looking at this question about how COVID's affected teaching and learning, we really wanted to kind of split it up between two halves. So looking at the K-12 perspective, where we'll have Judith Hanta coming at it from the perspective of secondary schools, Jeff Cummings and Ian Witten from TVO in terms of how that feeds in from an online tutoring perspective, which has become, of course, a very different different element in the context of a lot of the online presence that's taken place and become more common in the past couple of years. We will, after those sort of prompting questions and discussions that we'll get from Judith, Jeff, and Ian, we'll be going into a breakout discussion for a little over half an hour, or close to an hour, and then we'll be doing our breakout report to close that off. So the idea here is each group will have an opportunity to kind of put together some ideas as reactions to the prompting questions coming from Judith, Jeff, and Ian, and then share that back with the group. So we will be skipping the Q&A portion, and more of that will be happening through the breakout discussion. The afternoon is pretty much a mirror of the morning. So with the difference being the sort of the higher ed perspective. So Chad Manning from Humber College will be discussing from the point of view of the college experience, and Andy Brzen from UTM will be looking at it from the perspective of undergraduate mathematics. Again, we'll follow that with about a half an hour breakout discussion and about another half an hour to kind of unpack some of that into the breakout reports. And we'll be closing off with sort of an open discussion before wrapping up for the year. So without any further ado, I'll just hand it over to Teresa to introduce Judith.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Our first session, as Charles has mentioned, is we're going to be looking at the K-12 perspective. Our guest speakers' bios are included in the agenda, so I'm not going to read them to you, but I will highlight the following for you. Our first guest speaker is Judith Hanta, I know her as Judy. She's from the Hamilton Wentworth Catholic District School Board. Judy is currently the department head of mathematics at St. Mary's Secondary Catholic School in Hamilton. She teaches mathematics and computer science. She is known as a transition specialist for those grade 8 students entering high school, and for those in grade 12 calculus and vectors students who are entering the first year university mathematics. Judy inspires and motivates the joy of learning for all students and colleagues, being one myself. Judy's pedagogical practices are a true testament that mathematics can be learned by all. Judy was involved in the Ministry of Education CLIPS, Critical Learning Instructional Path and Supports. Judith was also the recipient of Waterloo's Society of the Descartes Medal for her contribution to mathematics education. It is my honor to present Judy Hanta. Please welcome Judy. I'm looking forward to your discussion today.
Thank you, Teresa, for that introduction. So I'm just going to try and share my screen here. All right, now I'm going to have to leave the meeting because my permissions weren't set. So I can't share my screen without doing that.
We'll give that a couple minutes. Just in the meantime, we've opened up the mic, so if there's any other updates or points to touch on, we can have a couple minutes to touch on it here.
I'd like to share while we're waiting for Judy to come back. Something interesting in our board, I had talked to a couple of colleagues in high school, and with the Dstreaming, there's our board, the Brant Haldeman Norfolk Catholic District School Board, has started investigating spiraling. It was something that's been out for a long time, but with the Dstreaming, they're really focusing on helping those students in grade 9 by actually taking the curriculum that was there and kind of taking all the units and placing it back into every unit of study. And hopefully that will help the students in grade 9. And I'm going to hand it back to Judy because I see her slides are up.
Okay, sorry about that. I had to, I didn't adjust my system settings before I started. My apologies. So things I wanted to just touch on first were issues that we had pre-pandemic, that we know students have short attention spans, inability to delay gratification. There was an inability to focus and persevere, lack of resiliency, increased anxiety, more of a sense of entitlement to success without putting forth the effort. And the last 3 years, we've really seen an increase in students who are at the average level or above average level that are seeking accommodations that they technically wouldn't even be entitled to. And I'm just going to move to my next slide. Now, I just wanted to make you aware of what the stages of the pandemic look like. So from March 20th to June 20th, it was full shutdown, asynchronous learning. There certainly was a disparity in how teaching and learning was delivered. Some of us were able to use I know I created my own videos, but not everybody felt comfortable doing that. But any videos that I created and shared with my students, all of that was delivered asynchronous. And at the secondary level, it's important to remember that 13 out of 18 weeks, or 72% of course contact, was impacted. So if students were taking math, then they really taught 72% of that course themselves. And in the elementary school, that was 3.5 out of 10 months, or 35% of the math content there. From September 20th to June 21st, students got split into cohorts. They could not attend every day though. This is how it worked in high school. So 2 cohorts of 15 would make your class size of 30. They could attend one day, then they'd be expected to learn from home on the next. Or we had students who attended virtually, fully virtually. In the hybrid model, then teachers had to attend to both groups. So you had to attend to those coming in on alternate days, and also the groups that were learning completely virtual, or we had a virtual school in addition to the cohorts. We also were split either in quadmesters or octomesters, but regardless of whether schools boards called it a quadmester or an octomester, a course was delivered in 23 days. In the quadmester setup, students would attend for 2 weeks in one course, and then they would learn asynchronously in that course for the next 2 weeks, and they would be learning synchronously in their alternate course. So, but you only had 23 days of instruction. In the octomester, we delivered the whole entire course over a 4.5 week period. On the flip side, that means there was 47.5 weeks where those students received absolutely no math instruction whatsoever. There was no opportunity to contemplate new learning in these 23-day models. There was no depth of understanding, and we also really didn't have time to think about developing critical thinking. And we also had to cut back. So in a normal year, we would have 88 days in which to deliver our lessons. When we were doing a 23-day model, and we had to maybe use the last day for final assessments, we really only had 69 periods instead of 88 to deliver instruction. So we were focusing mostly on what we thought were the important concepts. Some teachers chose to teach half the course. So cohort A comes in, I teach a lesson. Cohort B comes in the next day, I reteach the same lesson. So that means some teachers only taught half of the math course. So that's going to create gaps, as not all content got presented to everybody. During the provincial lockdowns, that meant that 3 out of 8 credits were delivered synchronously, virtually, via whatever school boards were using, Teams, Zoom, Google Meet. So they could have had their math credit then. So their math credit was gained entirely in 23 days, but through virtual synchronous learning. Having never done virtual synchronous learning before, I can say it's definitely not the same as face-to-face learning. You cannot tell who's disengaged. There's no visual cues. In the classroom, you can tell when students aren't getting it, and you pivot based on that feedback through visuals. The diagnostic feedback using a chat box was limited because they were just typing questions into the chat box, or I was using icons to get feedback. Then September to June, quadmestered and first semester, there was no cohorting. That's an advantage. That means students can come in every day. They did have the option of either attending a hybrid or virtual school. And now instead of teaching 3 lessons a day, we're down to teaching 2. And we're giving them 46 days to master the content rather than 23. And right now in second semester, things are running normally. Now, I thought it would be interesting to put this chart up just so that you could see who is impacted. So this is the group that I believe they would be in the second year now. So this is when the initial shutdown, this group coming across in green, they were impacted for 1 semester only, but they could have had calculus in that semester. So when they head off to university, they had to really teach 72% of that course to themselves. This is the cohort that is currently in university right now. They would have had their grade 11 course impacted. Half of them would have, half of them wouldn't have, because they would have taken it in first semester. And then last year, they were in cohorts. All of their math classes that they took last year, which would have been advanced functions and calculus, would have been attending half day and doing the course in 23 days. And this is the group that is coming through now. And I expect they're going to have even more difficulty, this group in blue, than the group in red, because their grade 12 courses have been impacted, their grade 11, and for half of those students, their grade 10 course. Now, it is possible that some of the students in—
Sorry, could you say that again?
It is possible that some of the students in the blue there are taking calculus right now, in which case their calculus won't be impacted. So I'm expecting that the students coming along the blue diagonal are going to have more trouble. And then we can see coming down the orange diagonal, people heading off 2 years from now, their grade 12 won't be impacted at all. So I just thought that was an interesting slide, just so that you can see the impact of COVID learning and when it can be completely back to normal. By the time you get to 25, 26, only half of those students have had the grade 9 credit impacted, but they will have 3 years of learning unimpacted. So food for thought just on these little slides is the impact of COVID borne equally by all cohorts? Who do we think will experience learning gaps? Which students will have the greatest difficulty transitioning to tertiary learning? How can the impact of gaps caused by COVID be modeled as we make that transition? It could be from primary to secondary or secondary to tertiary. What impact will the removal, because I didn't realize that colleges were removing their remedial classes when Charles and I spoke earlier. What impact will that have, given that COVID has robbed them of opportunities to learn things? Also in universities, given the detrimental impact of learning an entire course of 23 days of study, just something to think about. What role should summer school play in teaching and learning? Because of course, all of summer school is done in 20 days. And then Charles asked me an interesting question. He asked me to think about, the positive or negative impacts, or what have I learned from the models that we applied during COVID? So one of my negative outcomes would be, unfortunately, these models led to grade inflation. In the initial lockdowns, and even last year, the province initially, in the initial lockdown, mandated grades could not drop during remote learning. Some boards last year, when schools went into remote learning, also mandated that grades could not drop. So if grades could not drop, then you're not averaging in any things that would have happened later on that might have dropped their grades. A 23-day model actually limits the number of unit tests that you could give students. It's really difficult in the 4.5 weeks to deliver a major test per week. It puts a lot of stress on the students. So some of us were trying to do a major test every 2 weeks. There was definitely a higher prevalence of open versus closed book assessment. My unit tests would normally be weighted 80%, but they dropped down to 45 to 50. There was a lot of academic dishonesty happening, some students opening group texts, using Symbol Lab or using PhotoMath to find the answers for them. And then we also had, parents advocating for us to bump marks even higher. Some positive outcomes that I found. I had never tried to ever use technology to create screen recordings before COVID happened. I'm going to retire at the end of this year, but if I wasn't, that would be the one thing I would continue moving forward. I would create a screen recording explaining my lesson, every single lesson that I would teach. It turns out it's extremely valuable for students who require more time to process. I was using it in grade 9 applied during the initial lockdown, and I had several parents contact me to say their child has a greater understanding of math now because they could watch that video 2, 3, 4, 5 times, whatever it took to figure out what was going on. So that is something I would definitely use moving forward. And then there was also this discovery of alternate ways to assess using a learning management system. We weren't really using it to its full potential before. I'm not even saying that I'm using it to its full potential now, but it provided me with some valuable insight. How should you fairly assess in a virtual or e-learning session so you're minimizing grade inflation? So I had tried building a data bank of 4 or more variations per question, randomization, built a unique assessment, assessing in different stages, which meant you could not do part 2 until you finish part 1. I had tried using enforced time limits to prevent making changes when time expired. There's also the flexibility in the LMS of editing time limits. So if a child has an IEP that gives them accommodations, I can give them a different time limit. And I'm still using this one on the bottom now. I'm giving multiple attempts on minor assessments and a second attempt on a major assessment. And I show them the ones they got wrong. It gives them an opportunity to correct their errors. So I do like that. And I would continue using that moving forward. And then I learned an awful lot about how to design questions on assessment so that you minimize cheating beforehand. So one of the first things we started doing was create a question. We put PhotoMath on our phones. We took a picture of the question and we took a look to see what information PhotoMath would give. If it was going to provide useful information, then we changed the question. You can require students to use methods presented in class because I understand how the derivative calculators online will work. And so I was requiring in a question like this on the bottom that they take the derivative of this using the chain rule. The online calculators will split this apart into a multiplier 4 to the -2. They'll change the base here, and then they will just use the derivative of an exponential function. That way I can check who is using the online calculator. Or I create a question such as the one on the bottom, that down here, that requires simplification first. They knew that they would be expected to expand and divide and change this to a sum or difference of power functions, and then take the derivative. Online derivative calculators will never massage first. So that's a way to tell who has been using either Symbol Lab or Wolfram Alpha to do the work for them. And then the other things I thought about in terms of positives from what we learned over this is that it definitely has opened the door to synchronous learning as an alternate for students who cannot come to the physical school. There are students who have severe anxiety, who just can't make it to school. Now we have a way to allow them to participate. I now have a multitude of observations about the limitations of asynchronous e-learning on student success, and then wondering about the impact that forced e-learning would have on students who had trouble with virtual synchronous. How would they be able to manage in virtual, not even virtual, it's just simply asynchronous e-learning? And as I noted on the bottom, it does open a debate on the inequity of a mandatory e-learning credit that is being delivered asynchronously. And then positive outcomes from my board, we ended up developing these, we're calling them non-credit prep courses. So we found now that students have big gaps. What did we do? We offered a 2-week course in the summer. And the goal was to help them close gaps that they might have had in grade 9 math before they moved to grade 10. So we're closing gap from the previous course. And then we're pre-teaching, get you ready for the next course. And my board has plans to continue moving forward, even once COVID has ended, to continue doing these courses. And then the importance of maybe mitigating these learning gaps prior to the transition. So we do have a gap closing course that you would take in grade 9. First semester, you take it before you take the Dstream course. I'm going to review important concepts from grade 7 and 8. And then I will extend it all the way out to grade 9. And then we also have a course that helps kids transition to tertiary level math, first year university. So they will take this in their grade 12 second semester, and we will cover differential calculus, integral calculus, and matrices. And then we'll also talk about learning skill wise, what it would take to be successful in university. And then some more food for thought questions. What should assessment look like in a virtual or e-learning course? How do you minimize academic dishonesty in a virtual or e-learning setting? What role should technology play in face-to-face synchronous learning? And what lessons learned during COVID could be applied to this new Dstream math course to ensure that students who studied at applied level would meet with success? And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you, Judy. That was very informative. Your observation and insight. And I know that you as a teacher have always done what's best for your students. You've always ran that last mile. It's very enlightening that, we think as COVID, the impact of COVID, but, we really look at all the negative issues, but never really looked at all the positive that came out of it as well. So thank you for bringing that to the surface. I thank you. It was awesome. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Charles.
Thanks so much, Teresa. So just going to check here. I can see that both Jeff and Ian are in the call. And if I can just confirm, Jeff and Ian, do you both have the co-host ability in order to share your screens?
I do. I don't think Jeff does, though.
Okay, let me just, I think.
Oh, looks like Jeff is sharing. Okay.
Okay, I do now. Can you hear me? Just want to double check.
Oh, I think I just cut you off, Jeff. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Would you be able to share that again?
Yep, I'm going to put the presentation back up if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. And just as you're putting that up, just to so you all can know who Jeff and Ian are. So Jeff Cummings is an education officer at TVO. He's passionate about changing classroom experience and creating innovative learning experience. During his career, Jeff has worked at the board system level to integrate technology to promote a vision of the creative classroom, which shifts students into modern, innovative learning spaces. Jeff has worked in the Math Knowledge Network community practice as a co-lead, where he's developed and integrated the grade 10 math coding mesh credit at Wellington Catholic District School Board. Jeff has worked extensively on integrating the provincial virtual learning environment in classroom practice and has presented at numerous conferences on the topic. Ian is an education officer with the Educational Partnerships K-12 Digital Learning at TVO on secondment from Blue Water District School Board. Ian has over 20 years experience in education, including 15 years in the classroom, 3 years as a technology-enabled learning and teaching contact, and 3 years on secondment to the Ministry of Education. As part of his current role, Ian will be working closely with Indigenous and Northern boards and their adoption of TVO resources. Ian is committed to inclusive and culturally relevant pedagogies and to exploring how digital technologies can support these goals. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles. Thank you for having us today. I'm just going to quickly add that we did bring along Ursbill, who is our Director of Education Partnerships at TVO, and probably the biggest reason for the growth and development of the TVO Mathify program in my view. So just so you're aware, and we hoped he could be here to help out with any key questions and give any historical context on the background of TVO Mathify. I'm, as mentioned, I'm an education officer, and my role currently, is mainly around supporting what is called the contact role in the various school boards in sharing the various TVO resources. It's been an exciting role as we begin our first year, Ian and I, in this support. So it's been, a very unique experience given, the pandemic and obviously the variety of learning models that have had to occur. But I've enjoyed, that role of supporting on that piece. And I'll turn it over to Ian, who will then start the presentation.
Thanks, Jeff. So not much more I can add to that after the introduction from Charles. And Jeff and I have been working very closely together this school year on a number of different things, but mainly around, how can we support boards as they adopt and utilize all of these wonderful things that TVO offers. If you want to just advance the slide. So the main thing that we were asked to talk about today was Mathify. So if you want to just go to the next slide. So kind of as a backgrounder to this, you might remember it, if you're not familiar with Mathify, you might remember it as homework help, okay? So I have some personal experience with that. My wife was a tutor for homework help for a number of years. So I saw secondhand, but very closely, how the system worked, okay? And so in essence, a student will log in to the currently Mathify system. And we'll talk about all the other stuff, but the core functionality is a live tutor that the student can interact with to get math help. Now, these tutors are trained in as math educators in Ontario. They're Ontario trained teachers, okay, and they are really, it's hard to kind of emphasize just how great, and that's a poor word to use here, but it really does have an impact on those students who use it. I saw firsthand the students who would continually come back to my wife for that help, often multiple times a night, as they encountered different problems with whatever, and certainly from one day to the next. So yes, this is an online service, and it functions primarily through an interactive whiteboard and either text or voice chat. But even there, the ability to create a relationship, with these people, and it's important to remember too that the students and the tutor, they have usernames. They are anonymous, okay, but they still are able to develop a relationship, a rapport, and we know how important that is for any teaching and learning. To have that personal connection. And so since the migration from homework help to Mathify, there has been an expansion in all of this other stuff around that core functionality of the one-on-one tutoring session, okay? So currently, and I'm sure you've been reading the slide there, currently we offer live tutors from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday to Friday, and then 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Sundays, okay? But beyond, and again, there's the voice and text options for interacting with, there's the interactive whiteboard, and it's basically an annotation tool, okay? So, as long as you have a browser, it doesn't matter if it's on a tablet, a phone, or a computer, you have access to the whiteboard, okay? Now, not touchscreen, but still, as long as you have a browser, you can interact with the system, okay? The stuff around that, though, there is basically, once you create an account, you have a locker that you can store sessions that you've had with tutors, okay? But there's also a question bank, okay? So these are basically what happens is you will take a question, and they're all broken down by grade and by topic, and then we will work through a question on a whiteboard, okay? And then we can basically create a snapshot an interactive snapshot of that whiteboard, and we put it into the question bank. So that if a student, number one, okay, well, I mean, teachers or students, they can go in, they can search the question bank for something that, you know, is required for the lesson or for, you know, additional help. Once they find it, they can basically create a copy of that in their own account. Okay, so they basically create a copy out of the question bank into their locker. Now, this is for students and teachers. Parents, we also highly encourage parents to go on there with their students or with their children to work through these as well. And once they're there, they can work through it. Teachers can actually send out a link to their students, and students can then create a copy into their locker and work on it. So it is this really cohesive kind of ecosystem that allows for you know, either a teacher to use this in their classroom to support their lesson, or for students who are at home and are looking for just a little help with a topic, you know, then they can find these questions in the question bank and continue to work on that. So it's, you know, I think, one thing I do want to mention before I forget, is that we also offer ambassadors. And I think this is a really, really critical piece of the whole puzzle for us, is that we have a number of educators around the province who will go into classrooms, go into staff meetings. You know, maybe it's you know, it's a parent night at a school. They'll go in and they will do a presentation, and they will help people get into the system, get registered, and get using it. And we get a lot, like there is a lot of uptake of the ambassador program across the province to help teachers and parents and students get into the system with as little, you know, obstruction as possible and get using it, you know, quickly. And I think that's pretty much. Yeah, so Jeff, if you want to take over, I think that's covers the basics of Mathify.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting my console out of the way, but I'm not sure if you're even seeing it. But I'm just talking about the support model here. If you can see the title, then that's great. If not, I apologize. Okay, so philosophically, you know, the TVO Mathify philosophy is based on support of students based on their prior knowledge. So in other words, we are meeting the student, you know, where they live with respect to their current experience. And we did a lot of discussion about this, about the pandemic and where we fit in this. And I think we've come to this place where, you know, the line that really works here is that we support students and educators with the work they are doing in their classroom. You know, full stop. That you know, we meet them where they are in their journey. So our tutors are trained to support, you know, what strategies are being utilized by the teacher in the classroom. So, and are in fact explicitly instructed in this training to support the teacher strategy and the student understanding. So, you know, philosophically, you know, if we speak about where we are, again, we meet the student where they are. And again, going back to that, it is the student learning needs that drive, you know, the use of TVO Mathify. So regardless of societal context, again, pandemic is something we can't avoid in this discussion, but I think in many ways, it's irrespective of the pandemic. You know, where a student is on their academic journey is where the tutor will meet them. And this has changed. So the pandemic in many ways has changed nothing with respect to the way that TVO Mathify, you know, engages in supporting students. There's always a focus on differentiation strategies to support an all learner approach, regardless of the grade level that they are entering the system. And we talked a little bit about the expanded mandate, which, you know, has occurred during the pandemic. And what I mean by that, you know, our hours of support increased significantly. Originally, the hours of support were 4:30 to 9 p.m. Obviously, the pandemic created, you know, a different context in that students were at home. So it became logical to, you know, potentially support the students all day long. that hasn't changed. That hasn't left as we've moved back into face-to-face experiences. And it, just as an example, when my daughter was sick from school with COVID, she was away a good couple of weeks, and she was struggling with math. And for us, and again, I'm coming at this as unbiased as possible, but for us, it was a godsend to have this ability to use this system and to support her learning during the day when she was detached from her teacher. So, and I think many students experience that. We also experienced an increase in the number of grades serviced from originally being grade 6 to 10. The expansion moved to increase to grade 11. And then recently grade 4 and 5, which I think is an interesting point, considering the new ability of students to utilize digital that may have been forced by this context of learn at home. And I'll just advance to my final slide here. So again, hopefully I'm not blocking it, but the Mathify expansion, I'll just quickly touch on this during the pandemic. So another point that we came to as we discussed the pandemic and TVO Mathify, we just see it as an example of how technology supports pedagogical practice and how that increased as a result of the pandemic. It can never be technology driving the the instructional practice. The pedagogy is always in our mind what drives the learning. So how does the technology support that? That is often the discussion around using the various tools within TVO Mathify. And so really the pandemic has changed nothing in that regard. Only that we know that there is increased comfort with using digital technology. And again, that's neither right or wrong to us, or there is no agenda on that side of things, but we are aware that more students have been within a digital context, and as a result of that, they have had more and more comfort with doing a tutorial experience. And again, I use my daughter as a very good example, who was very reticent about using TVO Mathify, but after some period of time in the pandemic, she became quite comfortable, being in a digital tool, dialoguing, discussing, and utilizing the various supports in it, whether it was a voice to text approach, tangible touch learning using the screen. We can't escape from the fact there was comfort that occurred. So it allowed more learners and educators to experience that comfort, with using Mathify as a digital platform. So we wanted to, if there were any questions, we wanted to leave a few moments of time, for that to occur. If not, thank you for listening and considering our program. I'll leave that back to you, Charles.
Well, I'm going to take over and say thank you to Ian and Jeff. TVO has been around for a long time, and they have always supported Ontario students. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done at TVO, because it really shows. Are there any questions out there? I can start with a question for sure. My concern with our resources, like we have such wonderful resources at our fingertips, our kids. Like I think back when I learned mathematics and I was in school, I didn't have these resources. I'm like, as a former math department as well, like we had Mathify, we always gave out the students the information. It's almost like you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. How do we get kids motivated to use these resources?
I'll jump in, and again, I know we have Urs here, so Urs, feel free to pop in. Like we do quite a bit from our side in trying to create comfort. And I think our ambassador program is one that we really hang our hat on, and trying to get people in to support the educator first of all, in seeing the tools, and then at the same time they connect the students directly to the tools with an interactive presentation. And we've been able to we've been able to leverage digital during the pandemic to do those presentations still. And again, these are certified teachers that are going in, doing that support. They're talking pedagogy, and at the same time, they are really trying to destigmatize the use of technology for these students. But I take your point. It's a challenging thing that not every learner will have success with, and we certainly know that there's a long way to go with an all learners approach in finding ways to engage students. To do that, at the end of the day, when they are struggling, how do we get them to utilize these tools and to take that leap at the end of the day to get that help that we know can be very helpful.
If I may, you've hit the nail right on the head. I think it's been the question at the forefront of our redesign of homework help into Mathify right from the beginning. How do we get those learners that really need the support to make use of it? And so there's a number of things that we did. Homework help was very much a tutor-centered resource where students had to go and line up and knock on the tutor door, and when they were let in, that's when they could then ask the question. We've flipped that on its head, and the accounts for students are available 24/7. They can go in and use the whiteboard. It's their account, it's their space, and when they are ready to get help from the tutor, they invite the tutor into their space. So we wanted to make it very much a learner-centered resource and encourage that ownership. The other thing that we've put at the forefront right from the beginning is, and it's one of the things that Jeff has talked about, that we try to encourage and form a partnership with the students' teachers. I think that it's absolutely essential that educators who are in the classroom that work with the students have the ability to also use Mathify, to encourage having students use it in the classroom so that they become comfortable, familiar with it, so that it doesn't become this scary step of going on their own after hours to talk to a stranger online, which in many ways is antithetical to what we've been telling students or kids all along. Don't talk to strangers online, don't talk to strangers online. And here we're asking them to do this. So by having the classroom teachers as partners, using it, promoting it, being comfortable themselves with it, and that's where the ambassador sessions come in, where they can actually see how it works. We really hope that those students that really need the help are going to be that much easier it'll be that much easier for them to take that step. To that effect, we have a session at OAMI where we have 2 classroom educators that are going to be taking a big chunk of our presentation on how they're using Mathify in the classroom. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. And so at this point, we're going to take a moment to go into the breakout rooms. So a lot of really interesting questions, I think, to reflect on, also reflect on critically, in terms of how all of these pieces fit together as we move forward from the COVID disruption. So the format we're going to be using for the breakout, just as a reminder, is we're going to take about half an hour to have that discussion happen. Once we've closed the breakout rooms, we're going to have a reporting back. We're going to keep the rooms fairly open, so you should be able to move from room to room if you need to. But otherwise, it is going to be open. So feel free to work from either of these 2 talks in your discussion. Just as a reminder here, we will be closing the breakout discussion at 11:25. So just as a heads up there, and we'll have about 10 minutes for the breakout reports afterwards. and share back from some of the discussion that was had. And the mics are open.
Asmita, were we group one?
We were, yes.
Okay, so I was duly elected by Miroslav to do the sort of review. So we sort of went around a whole bunch of ideas, but we came to the idea of the fact that the students are not, I'm going to say, as adult as they used to be. And so some schools are looking at these courses that run before first year, before the students actually get there. And we had a discussion around the idea that, is the course useful? One, is there a better way to be presenting the information that they don't know that they don't know? And the other part of the discussion, which we ran around, was should we be trying to build in some sort of student agency or autonomy, where the students who come in first year, they've basically been coddled. And even though the teachers who teach them, I'm going to do a little bit of agency here for the high school teachers, even though the high school teachers themselves know that they need to be more hands-off, they still get pressure from administration and parents that they need to be hand-holding these students. And so they're not prepared in a psychological sense to really jump into first year. So we juggled with all that. I think I've talked long.
All right. Excellent. Thanks so much, Jeff. On to room 2. Any additional thoughts or overlapping?
I think Jeff Harrison, this is our room. Jeff, do you want to go? Another Jeff. There's a lot of Jeff today.
Sorry, my mic was muted there, Joyce.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead, sure. So we talked about several things. A big thing we talked about was teacher wellness and student wellness as well, but the whole wellness package, where there seems to be massive burnout of teachers due to the workload that was imposed on them. And most teachers, of course, are going to try to do the best for their students, which might have negatively impacted their home life, their kids, their careers, all kinds of stuff. Another thing that we talked about was the learning gap problem, where depending on the delivery structure, whether it was hybrid asynchronous or hybrid synchronous or whatever, that it is clear that less of the courses were taught than would have been taught in a normal time, and that the pedagogy was very heavily negatively impacted. Thinking of things like group work, investigations, those kinds of things, which just weren't possible, or possible with severe limitations. And Joyce brought up the point too of student agency. A lot of what happened without any significant student agency. And that could be the same thing said of the Mathify from TVO, that we're not sure that there's a lot of student agency there, or is it more, here's the question and here's the solution from the tutor, and now we move on. So overall, we didn't see very much that was positive that came out of this.
You are muted, Charles.
Thank you so much.
Again?
So that's definitely an important angle, and we're seeing some common themes. There was definitely some of the sort of new practices that came out, and some of what Judy and Ian and Jeff talked about. So very interested in hearing more of that too. But on to room 3. Any key ideas that came out? There's a representative from room 3.
I'm not sure if I was in room 3, but I think there's a chance. Does anybody from else who was in my room know if we were room 3?
Yes, Brian, we are from room 3. Yes.
Okay, I don't know if you want to go. I don't know if you want to go, Jesse, or
I'm okay with you, say, presenting our team.
okay. We talked about a number of things. We started off talking, basically inspired by the TV Ontario, the TVO presentation, and spoke about within Ontario some of the restrictions that happen because of a lack of internet access globally across the province. And the fact that Ontario happens to be behind some of the other provinces in terms of getting internet access remotely, and how that sort of hinders and creates a question of accessibility for students who don't necessarily live in urban centers. But we also talked about kind of the phenomena of online teaching in general. And unlike, I guess, the room 2, I think we were looking at it from a more positive perspective. We spoke about a number of different things, I mean, including asynchronous versus synchronous. We also ended up talking about the idea of cheating, and in principle that there is kind of, I think from some negative experiences, there's this connection between cheating and online teaching and online learning. And I think my position certainly, and I think people shared this, is that that's not necessarily inherent in online education. And it has more to do with the connection between how assessments and the online learning experience. But I think the overall theme was that there are good things that can come out of both synchronous and asynchronous online education, but it's going to take time to learn how to actually make those happen. That this is not something that you can learn how to do. Teaching online is a very different method of teaching than many of us are used to in person. And like everything, you have to learn how to actually use those tools well. So it's not something we could have necessarily expected both students and teachers to be able to do, given the resources and the time frame they had from the transition. So, you know, it really is a matter of kind of rethinking how you actually engage with students. But the bottom line is that to have a successful online class, it really has to be inherently student-centered. And it's almost forced active learning. But in order to really be able to make that happen, it requires a new way of thinking of designing delivery and also assessments. So that's kind of my assessment of what we were talking about. Anybody else from our group want to?
Just want to thank you, Brian. That was wonderfully summarized. Thank you. Yes.
And I think one other point to ask is we did have a similar theme forum about 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, where we were much more fresh into the pandemic, and everybody was reacting. So I think one of the reasons why we decided to choose this theme this month is, you know, here we are 2 years on. Are some of these things solidifying, or some of these practices, you know, becoming more of sort of a reliable piece that can be used when it's appropriate? I think we're going to close off with room 4. You can see Andy was in. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Teresa voluntold me to do this. So we just started, first of all, talking about recognizing that we're digital immigrant students are digital natives, and most people in the position of education now, our experience is different from we were children and their experience, right? There's always something better or more exciting 24/7, binge watching on Netflix. And then we talked about how could we get students to participate more, talking during the lesson. And we sort of ended our conversation talking about, you know, the collapse of parenting, how students aren't ready for the experience. And we were talking about the roles that parents have played in this, that this has started about 18 years ago, really, that parents don't want their children to have to overcome challenges. They would prefer there not be challenges. I think that was most of the big ideas. I don't know, Teresa, did I miss anything there?
You did a fantastic job, Judy.
Thank you.
Well done.
And it looks like I misspoke. There is actually a room 5. So this would be,
This
if there's
is us.
any representative. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was in room 5 and I was volunteered to talk. So we talked a little bit about equity and thinking about kind of changing the pandemic, changing the way we kind of think about what are our goals in math. Like we've talked about the fact that a lot of the conversations focus around the lack of time. And we wondered about shifting to thinking about, okay, we have this limited time. What are the skills or the things that we really need students to do, to know, to move forward? And to really think about the curriculum and think about the way, what are those big ideas? Like, what are those big things we need to do? And is the big thing that we need them to do to be able to compute, or do we need them to be able to think and reason and to consider, you know, how those online and those time restrictions could help us kind of revamp the way we think about it. And we did focus a little bit about the push for students seems to be still around grades and getting those A's, and what could we do to kind of make it a more equitable experience, to have better mathematicians or better math thinkers, if what we focused on was what are the skills that are going to make them good people, and you know, the life skills and the reasoning and the problem solving abilities, and the independent critical thinkers. So what can we do in the classroom to help support those ideas and make it more about moving their learning forward, as opposed to this arbitrary, the curriculum says all 14-year-olds need this to get an A. If we remove the grades, does it change that and help level the playing field?
Important idea. So we are scheduled to take a bit of a break at 11:45, but what I'm thinking is, if it sounds like there's a few points that we've touched on and we've opened up here, so I think we can extend up until the next 5 minutes or so to see if there are any threads that anyone in the group would like to continue, or if there's any Q&As for the speakers that you'd like to revisit. So we've still got a little bit of time here before we take a quick bio break.
Charles, I just want to, as I informed you earlier today that I have to leave early, I should say, I would like to extend a thank you to both Judy, Ian, and Jeff, to all of them actually. This has been very, very inspiring, very eye-opening, and to know that in general, we're all looking for ways of improving education, regardless of what the challenges are in front of us. So thank you, kudos to all 3 of you for doing that for me this morning, for us. Great discussions, fantastic. Thank you on behalf of our committee and MathEd and NetFields. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. All right, so the floor is open.
See, maybe I'll mention one thing. It's part of a bigger discussion which relates to both high school, elementary school, actually, and university, to everything. And this is, so what is our responsibility? So where is the line between what we are expected and supposed to do and other things? See, for instance, when I think about my university, university seems to be accepting responsibility for every possible aspect of their students while they're on campus. So we have a sexual assault policy. We have workshops about relationships, about smoking, alcohol, community things. And very, very often these things dominate our discussions to the point where academic things are pushed in the background. So my question is this, and people have probably different opinions. So what is the role of university today? What is the role of high school today? You see, if university is to prepare people for real life, then you cannot treat students as being children and spoon feed them everything, right? So it's full of contradictions that actually we rarely address. So I want to hear from people. What do they think about what do they think about this?
Okay, Miroslav, you opened a can of worms I really didn't want to talk about.
No, but actually it's a good can. I think it's a good can.
So I agree. There's a lot of things that like in education, and I'm not saying the ministry, because we all have to have a ministry. We have the power to vote and we have the power to have a voice. But it's what's happening is in all levels is that it continues to be pushed down. Like we're looking at the well-being of the child. We're becoming doctors, lawyers, social workers, and then we're taken out of what the basis of what we're trying to teach. So at one point we'd be teaching our subject, and I want everybody to be accepted in class. I want them to feel comfortable and all that. But it really frustrates how much more can an instructor take, right? And it's like, okay, you want us to do all this. We want the same outcome. We want the students to do well. But it's like, we are always guided by something. And it's like, it takes away from, our main task. And it's getting harder and harder. So yeah, it really is. So you're right. It's like, how much more can we do? I don't know what the answer is. It's like, time is going to tell, I guess. But work together. How's that?
Yes.
Maybe I could push back a little bit, Miro, if that's okay. So one of the themes that's come out here is, I know Jennifer brought up the sort of the overemphasis on grades, for example, and I think that's a reality. Even though there's been a lot of observation that students are maybe 1 or 2 years behind, as has been mentioned in the chat. This must be really confusing, where the emphasis is maybe not as much on learning, but as maybe it is about catching up as quickly as possible so that you can get to university, or and is that an environment which is that on the student, or is it on the system in terms of the expectations that are being put on them? And I think, isn't it, where I guess I would ask, isn't it right to kind of self-reflect in terms of what's being expected of the students, in terms of what's going to be good for them, and if that means for them to be proficient in mathematics and to be able to use it in their work and everyday lives, and not holding them to a lower standard, then how do you do that given the disruptions that, we had a disruption in the past 2 years. It affected a lot of people, not everyone the same way, but there are all kinds of disruptions that affect students. And then how do you maintain that objectivity, given the fact that, as you said, in the university level, sort of the whole student, I don't want to say the whole child, but the whole person is being taken into account.
If I can add, I think this also reflects back on the collapse of parenting. Things that were previously under the domain or purview of the parent, these are things the parent would have taken care of. Parents are no longer doing these things. And now this has fallen onto the shoulders of educators to pick up the slack. This is not a new problem, but it has been ongoing for about 18 years. There are things that I do today that I would not have had to do 18 years ago because the parents would have been doing that.
I think one of the things we have to accept too, though, is the fact that there's an implicit assumption in this conversation that the definition of adult has stayed the same. So here's an example from the corporate world, because we hear these stories all the time now. For me, for my university and my circle of friends in corporate, is that students graduate and they're getting entry-level jobs. Human resources will get contacted by parents to negotiate their salaries. They'll have direct reports that they're in the working environment now. They'll tell them something's due on Friday. It's not done on Friday. It's not done on Monday. It's not like, there is no such thing as a hard deadline for these generations. I'm not saying it as a criticism. I mean, in a way I'm critical because I'm like, yeah, it's completely different from what I think of as comporting yourself as an adult. But it's a huge discussion in like human resources circle and corporate Canada that these are the workers we have now. Like, this is the expectations of this generation. How do we figure out to recruit excellent, excellent candidates, and how do we meet them halfway and still function in our usual environments? So I think that we, as university instructors, at least, I try to keep in mind that my definition of an adult and my expectations of the level of autonomy and what I think you should be able to do at this age is sort of built on what I expected you to be able to do by age 25. And it's not the same anymore. In terms of, if the entire generation has agreed that these are the rules they're playing by, we can't change it.
On that salient point, we'll take a quick bio break and circle back at 11:50, where we'll be continuing the discussion actually on this topic of how this touches in the higher ed context. Right, so you see. Just give a quick intro to Chad. For those who don't know him, Chad Manning is a professor of mathematics and statistics at Humber College. Throughout his 8+ years at Humber, Chad has taught a variety of mathematics and computer courses and also coordinated the Dan Andrea Math and Writing Center. He has a keen interest in using technology to enhance engagement, inclusiveness, and overall learning experiences of his students.
Thank you very much, Charles. Just going to share my screen here and jump into my presentation. Oh, and actually did not anticipate that being there. Go. So I titled my presentation, Innovation Should Not End with the Pandemic, and perhaps I should have added an innovation hopefully shouldn't have started with the pandemic either. So today I'm going to take you on a journey through time. I'm going to discuss my experiences pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and my plans and some experiences as we've started to come into this post-pandemic environment. I'm sure everyone knows in March 2020, colleges and universities reacted to the pandemic by suspending in-person classes. And we at Humber had 1 week off, essentially, off in quotation marks, to prepare for this new remote teaching and learning environment. And I found myself very much prepared, unlike I'm sure many others. And I wanted to start today with a bit of a journey. How was I prepared? And to answer that question, I have to go back even before the start of the pandemic. I have to go back to really my teaching career and where that started. So the journey today will begin way in the past. When I first started teaching, my teaching style mimicked how I was taught, and that was using a whiteboard. I studied at Waterloo for my undergrad, York for my master's, and in just about every math class that I ever took, it was students watching the teacher write notes on a blackboard or a whiteboard. And so that's really how I started teaching, was writing notes on a whiteboard. And as I started teaching new courses, I discovered publisher slides. So I switched from the whiteboard now to that screen in the corner of the classroom. And that started opening up a new door for me. It saved me some time in class. I wasn't writing notes. I could engage with students better because my back wasn't to them. It also was a bit more accessible to the students because they now had a copy of the notes. They themselves weren't just spending class writing, copying down what I was saying and trying to keep up, which was very much my experience in university. It was trying to write notes fast enough to make sure it didn't get erased before you were done writing. And it made the learning experience not so much an in-class thing. I felt more like a typist just trying to record everything that I could then go back and learn from later. The downside to PowerPoints is that they take quite a bit of time to prepare. Even with the publisher slides, I found there was a lot of things I wanted to adjust, and any sort of equations or math in them, it was very difficult to make flow nicely with animations and whatnot. And so then I came across Richard Mitchell's smile, and no, not his stunning good looks and that affectionate smile that he had, but this was his synchronous mobile interactive learning environment. I attended his presentation back in 2018. And in this presentation, he was advocating for the use of Blackboard Collaborate within his classroom in this hybrid model that allowed students to attend remotely, even though he was presenting a live in-person class. And this doesn't sound like such an innovative idea these days, but back then it was. This was well before the pandemic in March 2018. And this really inspired me to, especially as a newer part-time professor, to really enhance what I was doing. And this presentation I attended was very well timed for me, because in the next fall 2018, I taught my first online course. And I decided, well, let's try to use Blackboard Collaborate. And again, this doesn't seem very innovative these days now that we've gone through the pandemic and all made this switch. But at the time, online courses were very asynchronous, at least my experience of seeing them, learning them. It was very much an asynchronous thing. So what I decided to do, much from discussions with Richard, I decided to record my lesson videos each week, but invite the students to attend these live. So they had the option to either just watch videos on their own time or join, engage, ask questions. And admittedly, not many chose that path, but the ones that did seemed to get a great benefit from it. The one thing I do want to say is I didn't have any fancy equipment though. I was using a desktop computer with a keyboard, a mouse, and Microsoft OneNote. And so at the time, that was really something that held me back from trying to do it. And I just decided to go for it this term with the online course. And just to give a bit of a sample, my writing might have actually been almost better than it is these days just using a mouse, whereas now I'm using much more equipment than just a mouse. But as you can see here, my experience wasn't as bad as one might expect from just using a mouse. I limited how much I would write because it was a bit slower and time consuming, and I'd type things here and there. But the experience wasn't as bad as I made it out to be in my head. I was just very nervous about taking this step, and starting is often the hardest part. So now that I had started, over the next few terms, I started finding the right tools. I started kind of honing my craft. I bought an iPad, an Apple Pencil, and I tried using that in the classroom. I would connect the Podium computer, log into my OneNote, share a OneNote file on the screen, and have that same OneNote file on my iPad. And I'd be writing on my iPad, walking around class, and it would be syncing to the Podium. But there was a little bit of a delay. So then I decided, well, let's join the Podium to my laptop directly. I switched to a touchscreen laptop, connected with an HDMI cable, and that seemed to work, but it decreased the engagement a bit because I wasn't as mobile in the classroom. But then I also had a student who shared with me that the PDFs from OneNote that I was posting to the online learning environment, they weren't very accessible. She couldn't Control F and find certain parts of the notes. So I started uploading Word documents of the notes, just sort of copying and pasting from the OneNote, making some changes. And with accessibility in mind, I actually switched in fall 2020 entirely to Microsoft Word. I learned that there was, with a touchscreen and a stylus, there was pen and annotation capabilities now within Microsoft Word. So I started using that because it had much better accessibility when I converted it and shared it with students as a PDF. And that's basically where I've been now, is I'm using Microsoft Word over OneNote. It hasn't been as nice of an annotation software. It's a bit jumpy because it's not made for annotations. But this path really prepared me well for the pandemic that then hit. And so that brings us to what I'm calling the present, the recent past and present. And my innovation had paid off, as I said. With the switch to teaching remotely, I was still able and am still able to use the same tools and the same process that I had been using. I would post a PDF version of the notes ahead of class. This was the Word document converted to PDF, which was searchable and accessible to students. It interacts well with screen readers as a Word to PDF file. And then in class, I'm presenting the material in Microsoft Word and adding my annotations with my stylus. And then I'm even sharing the annotated version of the notes after class with students. And my goal here, the reason why I want to do all of this, is not so students can just read these later and not attend class, but so that when they're in class, they can be listening, engaging, and making small adjustments to the notes here and there, and not just having to be that typist who's frantically trying to record everything I'm saying so that they have it on file, right? They have that documentation of what was said so they can refer back to it later. Some students might have an accessibility accommodation to have a note taker, and that's for various reasons, but I feel like a note-taking service is something that benefits all students. So I decided to essentially become the note taker and share these notes with students, which I can do with some form of technology. And in these virtual classes, I'm still able to use other activities that I do, which I haven't talked much about yet today, but I use Mentimeter for introductions, recaps, and answer take-ups. That still works just as well virtually as it did in class. I have a podcast that I use in a lesson that works just as well. Google Sheets, this actually works even better now that we're online and all students are on a computer, whereas before not everyone had a computer in the classroom. And then breakout groups, still most, if not all by now, of these online presentation softwares, they all have some form of breakout group. So in person, you might have done physical clusters of students. That's still possible in this virtual environment. So any sort of innovation that I had done prior to the pandemic really paid off, and I didn't find that I lost anything in my method of teaching when the pandemic hit. What really changed for me was now my classes were in Blackboard Collaborate, just like the online course I had taught, but that was new for the majority of my classes. And the benefit to that is I was now able to, in addition to just reaching virtual students, I could also record the lesson and post that online for students to watch or rewatch. And this was touched on in some earlier sessions, where the benefit to students being able to take that extra time, if they need it, to pause, work through a question, play and see it worked out, and maybe pause it to catch a mistake, that was huge for a lot of students. And again, it's not always just for students with, I'll say, something noticeable, a noticeable disability or accommodation. This benefits everyone. A student might be a little slower, and this now lets them keep the pace that they need. If someone is sick, normally they'd have to get notes from a friend. I remember being sick in university and not really talking to many people and just kind of in a panic to try to get notes from someone that I could photocopy at the library and then give back to them. So the recordings were a huge benefit to me of the pandemic. And spoiler alert, it is something that I'm hoping to continue, but of course comes with some risks. I also found that during the pandemic, I was able to incorporate more technology into my lessons. So I was able to in class use things like Excel or Desmos for graphing or calculations, and other online calculators. I teach statistics. So instead of using T tables and Z tables, we could now use an online Z distribution calculator or T distribution calculator. And I found that students took that a lot better. They liked the practical aspect, and I enjoyed giving them a bit more of a versatile learning experience. When it came to assessments, the quizzes, we at Humber made a move to ideas. This is what we call the Instruction, Delivery, Environment, and Assessment System. It's based off of the open source iMathAS system. This came with the creation of a lot of questions. So over the summer, we kind of worked our way through winter 2020. And then over the summer, there was a big push into this online environment where quizzes, assignments, and tests were all now created. And the questions for those were all created or coded. And they included randomization within the question. So sometimes randomization around the type of question being asked, almost always randomization to the values being used in the questions. And this again wasn't super innovative because we had worked with different publishers that had similar services in the past, but this was now a essentially free service to students where they didn't have to pay $80 for an access code to a publisher's system. We also had the added benefit with these quizzes where students could go back after the quiz was due and go into like a practice mode where they could do these questions over and over. And that was another thing that I wanted to strive towards pre-pandemic, was some form of randomized question sheet, because I would occasionally have students come to me and ask for more questions, more practice questions. And as a teacher, when there is just one or two students asking for that, I don't necessarily want to devote hours of my time to creating new questions. And doing so with these online quiz questions essentially made this help sheet or practice sheet that students could use over and over again with different questions each time. Tests is obviously a huge change. Virtual learning had perhaps the biggest impact on the testing environment. Students were now being assessed in a non-invigilated environment for the most part, and students now had access to notes and technology. It was essentially an open book test. And in some cases, even though we told students not to, seemed like a collaborative test, not an individual test. We held our tests within ideas. The questions had randomized values, and in a lot of questions I created randomized data sets as well. And a big change that I made to try to catch students that were cheating was I made my data sets different sizes. And that actually led me to catching a number of students cheating on tests where a student might have sent them their file, they'd paste in their data, but because it was a different size, it didn't overwrite all of the data from the other student. And I caught a few students cheating that way one term. So this academic integrity piece is really what I viewed as the biggest issue in a virtual learning environment, and perhaps the biggest change that I hope to make going forward. So as I look to the future, I think we shouldn't just return to our old ways of teaching. No, we have many new skills that we've all developed during the pandemic, and they should be put to use and even further developed. So what do I want to continue doing? Pretty much everything. I want to continue providing students with annotated notes, with lesson recordings, and I want to have interactive activities in class when possible, because there's always way too much to try fitting into the time that we seem to have with students at the college level. Of course, I don't want everything, I guess. I want online testing to revert back to in-class, invigilated testing. And that's not to say that we have to lose the virtual aspect to it, because we could have students working from computers in an invigilated environment. And that's really my hope for a change that I want to make a bit later. First, a change that we need to make, or I need to now in class, if I want to keep doing the Blackboard Collaborate thing, I need to account for both in-person and virtual students. And in some cases, this is a real struggle, but I find with math, most of the time, this is very doable. Many group activities can have in-person groups and virtual groups. To communicate effectively, I might need an on-ear Bluetooth headset, but that's pretty affordable. So really, now I look to improvements, wanting increased accessibility with a switch to Microsoft Teams. It comes with live captioning, which I'm excited about. And I really just want to keep using technology in class and on tests. So that's the big question that I'm now looking at for the future, is how can I allow students to learn and test in a more practical environment? There are some risks. I think I can skip over those based on my time. So I will end our journey there. And I'm sure we'll have some great discussions going forward in the later group chat.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chad.
Thank you.
So next, we'll be moving on to Andy Burizin from University of Toronto, Mississauga. Andy has a PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Waterloo and a master's of science in mathematics from McMaster University. At the University of Toronto, Mississauga, she's been teaching and providing mathematics support to undergraduate students at the Robert Giuseppe Academic Skills Center since 2016. As of July 2021, she is an assistant professor teaching stream. Thank you, Andy.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a treat to give presentations to the field's MathEd folk. So let me start sharing my screen. And let's start sharing this. Slideshow. Okay, just give it a second. I'm really sorry. Okay, so the title of my talk is 2021-2022 was okay-ish. So I've already been introduced. I'm Andy, so thank you for having me. So this is just my abstract for my talk. So we started from the bottom, fall 2021, and now we're here at the end of winter 2022. So yes, it was a very turbulent academic year, and there was a lot of challenges and many uncertainties on the horizon. And once the waters have settled towards the end of winter 2022, I think everything turned out okay. So yes, I'm going to mention some negatives, but I tried really hard to find positives and I found them, and I'll share them with you. So some negatives of this past academic year. Going from online to in person was just soul sucking. And before we came back to being in person in winter 2022, I told my students, get ready, start moving. That whole physical aspect of being on campus is going to hit you like a brick wall. And once it hits you, you know, your energy, your motivation to do things is going to drop and plummet. And it wasn't really easy to transform yourself from an online learning environment to an in-person learning environment. Be it a student, be it an instructor, it was both ends a very challenging time to actually be back on campus. A lot of mental health claims. There was an increase on mental health claims when we came back to being in person, but I feel that that was mostly because students were hit with that brick wall and they didn't know how to cope. Right? They were like deer looking at headlights. And so a lot of these mental health claims came about. They were, you know, anxious about whatever they're doing in their academics, and they needed that support and whatnot. So when it came back to in-person assessments, a lot of students were asking for more support and more accommodations. One thing that I've done for my final exam in a course that I co-managed, a second-year math course, I gave a formula sheet. I've never done that before in my life for a second-year course. Some of my colleagues actually said to the kids, you can bring a calculator with you to a final exam. And if you know the tradition of my department, my math department, you never had calculators. Didn't matter what year you were writing your exam or your in-person test, you never had a calculator. So a lot of these extras were given, these aids and resources to students when we transitioned back to being in person. A lot of my colleagues across Canada feared that the failure rates were going to increase for my courses. Brace yourselves, they didn't learn anything. I'll get back to that point a bit later. Once we came back in person, as I said, the soul-sucking transition, there was a lack of student engagement. And I really noticed this with our discussion forum, Piazza. So before the in-person, component that we had when we transitioned back, Piazza, yes, kids asked questions from time to time. But as soon as we came back to being in person, Piazza was dead. Literally, like just before a test or an exam, that's when questions were being asked on Piazza by students. Before that, kids were not engaged, they were disconnected. In-person assessments with COVID around. So 2021 fall, it was really interesting being in post-secondary because we didn't know whether or not we're going to be online or in person. It was still all up in the air. Our administrators weren't very clear as to what was going to happen. And as we saw, we were online. And then winter 2022 happened, right? And again, for some of us, we were still up in the air. When are we going to come back? When are we going to be in person? And so for a good portion of winter 2022, most Canadian universities were online, and sometime in February, everyone transitioned back to being in person. And so decisions had to be made, right? So do we continue having online assessments or in-person assessments? I, for one, chose to have online assessments for the term. For the term, I decided to have online assessments to continue with the pattern. I wasn't sure whether or not, COVID would take another U-turn or give us a speed bump, and then we'd have to go back to, online if I decided to do in-person assessments. And then later on, I didn't want to have discussion with students, in-person assessments were so much more harder than online ones and all that fluff. So I decided to keep my assessments online during term. I also thought about safety of my students, because when you have a course in post-secondary, when it comes to university, there could be hundreds to thousands of students writing in various rooms. And I wanted to make sure that everyone was safe, that there was social distancing and whatnot. That was important to me. However, at my university, final exams had to be in person. Okay, so final exams had to be in person, which was a little bit of a deficit, I think, for my students. And what was that deficit is my next slide. So this is from my second year math course. And the deficit is here. I don't think that my students, and I feel really bad about this, were ready to write an in-person assessment. For the past 2 years, they've been writing online assessments, and the type of studying for online assessments is very different than in person. So when we had online assessments, a lot of instructors would be like, oh, use Decimals.com, because we knew Decimals.com was available for students if we weren't supervising them. And so I did tell my students many times, use Decimals.com to help you out with your homework, or to do this test question when you're doing the online assessment of mine. But it was really sad when I had my in-person final exam. Most kids could not graph y = ln x. And these are just some renditions. These are my renditions. I protected the privacy of my students, but these are some examples. And if you see the first to the left in the upper right-hand corner, those were the most representations of y = ln x. So maybe, scale back on the technology. So what's the point of having technology if you don't know what you're plugging in or how to work with what you're plugging in? So that's something that I'm going to think about a little bit more as I go back in person, is scaling back the technology and try to emphasize the fact to use technology to support your learning. That is, to check whether or not you have the correct final answer. to, get a bit of a head start on your question if you're lost, but not to search for the final answer. Another issue was parametrization. So we talked about it. And if you see to the left here, the kid had some understanding of parametrization, but it broke my heart that this 3, the kid rounded the square root of 2 to 3, because working with decimals is hard. So again, at my university or in my department, traditionally, we don't have calculators that kids use during in-person assessments. And so this is one of the reasons why I want to pull back from using, calculators because of such issues. I do believe kids had the affordance of using whatever they wanted while they were online. And it breaks my heart to see, that the square root of 2 was rounded to 3. And so even when you have these parametrizations here, I mean, the example here to the right, line X, line 2, I wasn't quite sure the communication was lost. And I'm pretty sure that if this was an online assessment, this student would probably, have flying colors because it used Desmos, but they've never actually internalized what the heck they were probably dumping into Desmos. So I'm going to think about, scaling back on the technology because I want the students to understand what they're plugging in, right? And sometimes, when you plug things into technology, there's artifacts and students don't pick up on that and they believe, oh yeah, this is the output. So I'm a little disappointed. I feel like I failed my students because I did tell my students, use Desmos, but this is the downside of it when I came back to being in person. Now, some positives, yes, I have positives. I tried real hard, I have several. Some students, and I love talking to students. If there's any event that I need to do, I can always call them up because I have that conversation with them and they love telling me about what they're experiencing. And I think it's important to know what they're experiencing. So for in-person assessments, I've learned from various students that they're actually studying more now, right? Because they've realized that, doing things online is very different than doing things in person. So this was very good to hear, very positive, optimistic. Students were really, eager to participate in any final exam preparation sessions that my university or my campus has set out. So Exam Jam is one of them. And pre-COVID, I actually hosted sessions for Exam Jam. And I'll tell you, the attendance was, okay, a little bit better than 0. But when we had the Exam Jam for winter 2022, in particular for my linear algebra course that I was teaching, I expected no one to show up. And lo and behold, there's more than 100 students that showed up. And I was like, I didn't expect this crowd. And it was really refreshing that students were really eager. I guess they were scared of what will be. And so they tried to, take on any resource that they can find to help them for something such as a final exam being written in person. Some students loved being in person, right? They wanted that social interaction with other peers, especially after an assessment. And this is for one of my students who's on the call right now. So my dear student that's on the call has actually said this to me. When you write an assessment and you did badly, say that you're in person. You go away from the testing room, you're outside of the testing room, you talk to your peers, you vent about, oh, it was so hard, or whatever. You get this bond going with your peers. And just that whole physical, you removing yourself from the testing room helps with your mental health, I think. But when you're online and say that you do really poopy on an assessment, you're stuck in that room wherever you study or wherever you do your assessment, and you're agonizing by yourself and you don't know how your peers are doing. So maybe some actually, connect on Discord or whatever other social media, but you're still stuck in that same space. And that you have another 3 assignments due, and you're still thinking about that test. So just being in person makes, I think, a huge difference when it comes to writing an assessment for kids, because they actually remove themselves. You walk away, you clear your mind. Yes, I did bad, but it's not as I'm going to be dwelling about it for the next 6 hours, that I did bad and I have 3 more tests to think about in the next couple of days and whatnot. Final grades, in my opinion, for the course that I've co-managed were not as horrible as predicted. I honestly thought, boom, it's going to be like such a doozy that these kids are going to fail everything that I gave them on the final exam. It wasn't that bad. And I only had one complaint about a final grade change. Well, I didn't give it because there was no merit for changing it. But I feel that students actually realize, yeah, things are different. And maybe, yeah, I deserve that grade that I got. I didn't have too many complaints. Typically pre-COVID, during COVID, I'd have a slew of emails. Oh, I do believe I deserve a better grade. But shockingly for this past term, I only had one complaint about a final grade in the course that I co-managed. And guess what, guys? We all survived. I mean, give yourself a pat on the back, okay? We all survived this, turbulent experience, and we're resilient, right? We stood up to the challenge. We made it. We got through to it. Good, bad, indifferent, however we thought about this experience, we did it. So moving forward for the future, and just a reminder to myself as I wear every chain in the house, that's a little bit of Drake. Students are going to be students, right? They're always going to be chasing grades. They're always going to have excuses as to, why they want that extension or, why they couldn't write the tests. We just have to kind of accept that to some degree. There's always going to be issues. There was issues pre-COVID. There was issues during COVID. There's going to be issues post-COVID. There's always going to be issues about why our students can't learn, what's going on, da-da-da. And maybe just accept it, right? It's going to happen. And whatever the issues are being thrown at you, humans adjust. We're going to figure it out, right? We're going to get through the end of the tunnel. We're going to get to the touchdown zone, the field goal. No, hold on. End zone football. And so I have to also remind myself I have to do as much as I can. I can't be my students' everything, right? As much as I'm fluffy and I love talking to students and everything, I have to realize that I also have to have my own personal time, that I have to take care of my own mental health. So I want to do as much as I can, that at the end of the night when I go to bed, that I feel okay. Sure, mistakes are going to happen. I'm not the greatest instructor. I'm not the best. Sometimes I don't see things. But as long as I had my best intentions moving forward, I'll be okay. And the other thing that I think that we should all remember is that not every student is a math lover, as someone said in the chat box. Every student has a different intention as to why they come through our doors or why they are in our classrooms, right? So not everyone was going to get that A. Not everyone cares to get, that A. So we have to also recognize that we can't convert everyone. We can't make everyone to love the subject that we love so much. And after reflecting upon everything, I'm so Zen-like lately because I've moved myself away from the term has ended. You know what? It could have been worse. It could have been more catastrophic. So having that in mind, I'm very happy with whatever happened in fall 2021, winter 2022. It could have been worse. It could have been way worse. And for those of you on this call, the conversation continues. I love gathering people. And I'd be really happy to have you, inviting you personally to come to the 2022 UTM High School Math Teacher Dialogue. It's going to be online for safety reasons. Hopefully next year we'll be in person. We'll feed you, we'll pamper you at UTM. But please come out. It's on Wednesday, May 11th at 4 p.m. It's about 3 hours long. We have high school teachers and we have post-secondary instructors that are going to talk about, what they've experienced in 2021, 2022. As well, the fun continues with the first year math and stats in Canada. We have a conference coming up next week. If you're interested in knowing what happens in a post-secondary math and stats practitioner's life, please come out and shine. It is a one-day online event. You can email me, and that's all that I have to say. I think things turned out okay. Could have been worse. Thank you. Hello?
All right, thank you so much. I was having some trouble with the button there. So we are now going to move into our final set of breakout discussions. So we'll get it started now. And just given the time, we're going to be continuing in those breakout rooms until 1 o'clock. So here we go. All right, welcome back. Everyone's coming back in. There we go. All right. So I hope everyone had a chance to have a good, deep discussion. I know, I feel like well, I know at least in one room we cut it off mid-sentence. That's the way that it always goes with Breakout. So we'll start with room 1, just for the reports back on how COVID has changed teaching and learning mathematics.
So we had a lot of really interesting kind of divergent conversations, but a couple of the pieces that really kind of stepped out were sometimes the administrative piece on, you have to record your lectures, but then the technology in the classroom limits what we actually do as teachers. So this idea that there's still this sense that good university teaching is about lecture and standing up at the front of the room and talking at students. And we all know that doesn't work in a mathematics classroom, that we need to be interacting and we need to be talking, but the technology in the room forces us to stand at the front if we're going to have this mandate to record our lectures so everybody can have it. And this idea that with the idea of supporting everyone, that somebody somewhere is going to lose out if we're having to do this kind of one size fits all kind of piece to kind of implement that. So yeah, we had a lot of conversations around like what is, and then, how do we evaluate whether or not the things that we're doing actually works? How do we define success? And then we got into a side conversation around sometimes students learn things that we don't intend them to learn, but they're always learning something. So we may not define it as success because they didn't do, what our goals were, but remembering that students are always learning something from us. We just don't know necessarily what that is.
Fantastic, excellent, thank you. Anyone from room 2?
I'll speak for room 2. So we started off talking a bit about great uses for technology, but quickly got onto the topic of how technology becomes a bit too much of a crutch for students. And a lot of these students seem to be lacking the fundamentals and foundational skills, especially when it comes to graphing, to be able to visualize what a function should look like. And with that limitation, they're unable to make a lot of the leaps and critical analyses that should be done at a higher level of education. And the difficulty that professors and instructors and teachers are having to fill in that fundamental piece as we transition back into the classroom, particularly when it comes to testing and assessments, when students have been learning all year online with supports at their fingertips and now come back to an in-person exam and don't have what they're used to. And so that might get a bit better as they get more used to this new testing environment. We talked a bit about kind of coaching students in what to expect. We talked a bit as well about just with students being so dependent on technology that it's taking them a lot more time to work through any types of questions. And so with time-constrained assessments, it is very detrimental for students to be using technology and using resources as much as they have been.
Important insight. On to room 3.
I think Andy had something to add to room 2. It looks like maybe there's a hand up. Oh no, it's applause. Oh, applause. Sorry.
On to room 3.
I think from our room we had Brian and Judy. So I don't know if they would like to say on behalf of everyone. Actually, the major things that we discussed was about rethinking assessment. Like we were like more or less it was concerning about how we can, like the students are cheating in certain exams, so like online tests and quizzes. So how we can think about certain alternate ways where we like where the students could demonstrate their thinking, like what kind of questions we should reconsider, whether randomization would work or not. So what are the different ways, alternate ways we can think of assessment? So major discussion was around those ideas, like and how we can make our like when we are thinking about teaching and learning mathematical concepts, for how we can make them critical thinkers, and when we are thinking about like assessing for learning, what changes and what differently we have to think about assessment. So these were the major ideas we were discussing about in our group. So anything if Brian would like to add, or Judy, if you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to step away. I think you said everything that I would say. Thanks a lot.
Agreed, you summarized very well.
Right. So we are near the end of the session. We are going to have some time a little bit past for open discussion, but just as we're together now, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank the organizers of today's session, as well as the speakers. Kate Zhang and Teresa Mosher were the organizers for today's session. Unfortunately, Kate wasn't able to participate verbally today, but she was here with us. And also big thanks to Judy, Ian, Jeff, Chad, and Andy for helping us get into some of these experiences that you've had personally, as well as within the environment that you operate. It's clear that this has allowed some of this discussion to really flow over between all levels of education. And I think in particular, I'd like to thank Judy for helping to show that progression from year to year, from grade to grade, and sort of highlighting that contextual aspect, which is the students that are having or building certain habits, or who are facing certain challenges, having certain gaps in their skill set or mathematical development. Those don't go away; they just go on to the next year, and then the next generation, the next level, they're going to be going through their own piece, and and I think that's one of the advantages of the forum, is that we're able to have those discussions across all of the levels here. And of course, we will be coming back in September. That being said, the summer is full of conferences and events. We heard of a number of them today, where those of you who are interested in continuing a lot of the conversations we had today, I think there'll be a lot of avenues coming up in the next few weeks, next few months. As on behalf of the steering committee, I'd like to just say thanks for the participation and the rich discussion over the past year. And we're looking forward to seeing many of you as we start off the new academic year in September.